Hey everybody, Josh Sigurdson, World Alternative Media here, and of course we're joined by author and economic analyst here at WAM, John Sneisen, and we are heading closer to that technocratic future that we speak of so often. Of course, the SDR, the special drawing rights at the IMF, have been the subject of a potentially bringing upon a cashless system, and there's no more technocratic society than China, and it seems like all of these forces are starting to come together pretty clear and cut. And as this article from Router says, IMF could be based in Beijing in a decade, says Lagarde. And as the article says, the International Monetary Fund could be based in Beijing in a decade if growth trends for China and other big emerging markets continue, and these are reflected in the fund's voting structure, IMF Managing Director Christine Lagarde said on Monday. Lagarde said at a Center for Global Development event in Washington that such a move was a possibility because the fund will need to increase the representation of major emerging markets as their economies grow larger and more influential, which might very well mean that if we have this conversation in 10 years' time, we might not be sitting in Washington, D.C. We'll do it in our Beijing head office, Lagarde said. So this is a major sign of the times, guys. I recently spoke with Patrick Wood in Montana, of course, the author of Technocracy Rising, where he talked about the emerging technocratic state in China going back into the 1970s under Nixon and then, of course, Ford and Carter, and how it grew in size and scope with the help of people like Zbigniew Brzezinski and the Trilateral Commission. And as we've gone into just recent times, we've seen the trend where China is trying to push for a cashless system. And I'm talking centrally planned cashless system, not stuff like Bitcoin. And as I always say, if your money's in the bank, it's not yours, it's the bank's. And if your money's always going through the bank through digital transactions and you don't hold it, you are basically owned by the bank. And this is all by government decree. So, John, can you go into what this would mean if the IMF, the fact of the matter is the IMF in the first place should not exist. It's an international governing body that's trying to create a world currency. It's insane. It's like the villain in a James Bond movie. They want to take over the world. But what does this mean in the long run, John?
Well, what you got to remember what the IMF is in the first place. They're basically an international bailout fund to bail out the economy when it fails. Because what has happened is you have international central banks all over the world. They've blown up their balance sheets by buying bad assets en masse, and what is happening is during the next crisis they don't have enough force to actually come in and buy all these other terrible assets that is out there, that has, of course, the banks got them off their balance sheets, but they just invested in more bad assets. And that's the way it goes. When you give free money away, people do terrible mistakes with it, and it always will. And of course they don't care because they made a little fees and a little money here and there, and that's how the banks, of course, do their business. Now let me explain quickly how the IMF works, though, and why she's talking about this move to China. Because what the IMF has, it has something called a voting structure based on your special drawing rights quota. Now, your special drawing rights quota is X amount of special drawing rights that your country holds. Now, the current percentage of voting power you get from that quota that you hold, this is what's happening. So you got China together with the BRICS countries allying to get the majority voting power so they could stop the US from vetoing. So now they could veto in the IMF and they would get full power over everything that happens. So if you go through the numbers, the U.S. currently have 17.96% voting power. So, of course, compared to China has only 6.41%. Well, China is a way bigger economy. So what she's also talking about is they're looking at, moving these quotas up because China is such a bigger economy than, not a bigger than the U.S., but very similar to the U.S., so why shouldn't they have, the similar type of voting power?
And there's been a massive power shift over to China as well, because it's almost like a test society. Like, they're trying to create a society much like China, because it's not as, by regulatory power against individuals, yes, it's quite communistic, but by governing power over corporations, etc., etc., it's technocratic and it's by government decree and it's government in basically all the markets just monopolizing corporations.
Well, it's all about creating that one world government,
Yeah.
and the IMF will be, the central bank of the one world government. Now, just to show, I said that China had 6.41% voting power, so that's nothing compared to the United States. But of course, they've allied with the BRICS countries: Brazil, India, Brazil, Russia, India. China, of course, and South Africa,
and Iran,
those countries,
and the Philippines.
But those countries have 14.87% voting power. So there you see, like, it's very close to actually the BRICS countries taking over the power from the United States. And that's going to be the big shift in the world economy. And it's, of course, it's going to happen if you still let the IMF be around. It's no doubt that, China and others will get that voting power. They will have full control. And that should really put some fear in you when you have China getting the majority voting power here, which is a communist country.
Yeah.
We should be very concerned about that, and it doesn't seem like anybody really cares too much for what's happening on that global scale. But that is the problem. In my book, the Canada, the Greatest Economy in the World, I write about, of course, the United Nations plan to take over and create a one world government, and the IMF is a perfect puzzle piece for them to have that central bank to take over with the special drawing right. And what they talked about is, of course, now with the new blockchain technology coming out and cashless society move, they want to have the special drawing rights, either depending on what happens, because they got two options. They could either just go fiat with the special drawing right, or they could back it by gold, depending on what happens. People's distrust. Whatever happens, but
if it's under gold, they're still going to be printing way more paper than they have gold.
And they would have control. Like now, we have a global currency that has control over everybody. You would never use that currency because what their plan is, and they stated this in documents that you can read about in the book. They stated that they will let the local countries have their own currencies, but they're going to be severely devalued. So you thought you sat on a whole bunch of paper fiat assets in your local currency. Well, now. Like Argentinians and others would tell you, that's a very bad mistake. And of course, they have learned. A lot of them have learned, but of course, some of them haven't. And here in the Western world, we haven't really seen a devaluation of a currency yet, because what happened with the United States? You got to remember. In 1971, they became the world reserve currency, so everybody started using it. They were on the brink in 1971 of failing the United States dollar.
It should have happened.
Yeah, it was about to collapse. And it would have been rightly do so, because they just have printed too much money.
Well, I want to throw something in there, though, John. While we haven't seen devaluation on a great scale, we have seen massive devaluation all the same over the years, because the U.S. fiat dollar has devalued insanely.
Well, a slow trickle type of thing where you can't really see it. That's the hidden inflation of tax that we don't really see full time. I'm talking about when these style devaluations are coming. You're talking about 75 to 90% most likely, and maybe even more of a devaluation of the value that you thought you had overnight. So these are dangerous times, and of course the plan is here to implement this and then have that one world government. I find it so funny that people say that it's a conspiracy theory wanting to have one world government. Well, they have Jim Rickards wrote about it in his book. Where remember we exposed the Panama Papers of being a false flag to implement a one world government. But because we wrote we read the actual documents that they had before they implemented what James Rickards was talking about. So in his book, actually, you got like, wow, he's actually talking about what we talked about, and now there's a physical document and a treaty that they're putting together.
I've read thousands of leaked government documents that talk about creating a one world order, a one world government. It's not a conspiracy theory. It's a conspiracy all the same. But when you see just decades and decades of politicians, presidents, prime ministers, etc., calling for this one world government, it's no longer a conspiracy theory, folks. And those that say that it is a conspiracy theory are the real conspiracy theorists, because they are just assuming without any base, in fact, that this is not an agenda that's being carried out. And the fact of the matter is, the United Nations is already a world government. government. It's already on our doorstep, and it already has power over individuals, regulations, taxes. They're trying to create a global taxation system where they can stop people from hiding their money from the extortion from the state. This is real, folks, and the fact of the matter is, no one is willing to go into it. The media is not willing to talk about it. They're willing to promote the propaganda that actually lifts this, agenda off the ground, but they aren't willing. No one in the media is willing to actually go into talking about exactly what the IMF is doing. And the IMF is leaving countries in ruins, in debt. There's nothing that they love more than the debt of the individual, because when someone's in debt, as I say so much at WHAM, you fall down that bottomless pit of debt, and then you're forced to ask for a ladder up from the government and the banking system, and that puts you in servitude. It's perfect for them. They love a welfare system. They love debt. They love poverty because it makes them more powerful.
The International Monetary Fund is so corrupt, Josh. It's just ridiculous. Just search them up online and search up different countries that what happened there. Well, what happens is they borrow money to corrupt leaders in the countries. And we talked to people when we did our Suriname video. I had people contacting me and saying like, yeah, they just recently took an IMF loan and all the money went because they just stole the money, the leaders. And this is what happens everywhere. And then of course the people are left with the bill to pay, and now we got a population of slaves that you can control.
And they're like, oh, it's convenient, so we can get a centrally planned cashless system in where we can be traced everywhere. We never hold our money. It's never our money because it's always held by the government and the banking system. And as Jim Rogers said in a recent interview that I did with him, you are basically owned by the government when you have a centrally planned cashless system via legal tender laws and control by the state and the banking system. This is very serious, folks. This is the end game, and we have to start talking a bit more loudly about it, because people have to stop mixing up, for example, Bitcoin and cryptocurrency, that which is hidden, which is crypto. People have to stop mixing up decentralization with centralization. That is the key. When it's centralized, it can be controlled, manipulated, and used against your advantage, your benefit, and to the benefit of the state and the banking system. But Bitcoin, stuff like that, that is decentralized. It cannot be entirely controlled. It can be manipulated to a smaller extent, but cannot be controlled. And in the long run, I mean, you look at governments around the world, they're freaking out about Bitcoin and stuff like that. They're trying to stop people from using it. They're trying to put in laws that call you a terrorist if you use it, like the recent law that was implemented in the United States. When you're crossing a border, you might have to give the TSA guard or agent, or to give the border patrol agent your phone, and for them to look at your Bitcoin and etc. And I think they're looking towards taxing for capital gains taxes, asset freezes, and stuff that we'll go over in
the
further
government
reports.
wants to tax you.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, Josh, this is the natural outcome of government throughout history. When you go and study governments all the way back to the democracy when it started, this whole structure down in Greece, what is happening is it always grows upon itself until it collapses, and then you have a collapse of an empire like the Roman Empire, or other big empires like the French empires, the Spanish empires. All of them goes to maximum, like they go from minimum of government to maximum of government, and then they go back to minimum or anarchy, which is no government.
Yeah, free market.
I'm not saying that anarchy is bad here. I'm saying that they go back to suddenly no government because the government collapsed in on itself by becoming too big. And of course,
voluntary societies under a private contract.
Yeah, with government comes greed. Like, that's innate in government. So of course, people that are run by greed in their minds, they would automatically levitate to the government and to these positions. And we've seen it so much today in politics and in government. It's just ridiculous of a power grab of human beings that are elevated, that have been elevated. Actually, we the populace have been elevating these corrupt officials up to the levels where they're at, without understanding the natural outcome of them wanting to get in those positions so they could get that power to get more power.
Absolutely, and it's perpetual. It repeats over and over and over again, and that which is implemented by the state to deter it under this guise of stopping monopolies ends up creating the monopolies. It creates a manipulation, it creates a debt, it creates a poverty, and it just goes on in a circle because people don't understand the system and they keep implementing the same perpetual issues or solutions over and over again, which create a new problem. The government cannot fix the problem of the government. The banking system surely isn't going to fix the problems of the banking system. We have to start acting a bit more as individuals and solve these problems from an individualist standpoint as a voluntary collective, if we so please. So this is very important to get into.
Well, this is interesting. I did a presentation for some people out in BC the other day, and there was one guy there asking me, what's the solution? What can we do? And I talked about, decentralized, localizing different currencies. Either it's time bartering or it's gold and silver using precious metals. And he said, well, what is the solution for the big government, like for our money today? Well, that's exactly what I said. Start on the local level and start getting away from the corrupt government fiat decree that you are forced to pound down your throat, that are losing value as we're talking because they're getting into mass amounts of debt.
Yeah, absolutely. Everything's manipulated, and that manipulation is met with more manipulation to fix the problems of the manipulation. And it sounds pretty crazy because it is crazy. So thanks for going into this with us, John, and we'll be back